Well, greetings, everyone. I hope this finds you well. If you have your Bible with you this morning, I invite you to take it out and join me in Psalm number 124. And while you're turning to Psalm 124, I want to take a moment to make a couple of announcements. If you read my thought for the day this last Wednesday, you know that we have decided to go ahead and have services starting on May the 31st. We'll be keeping our normal time at 9:30, and I've had the opportunity to call around through the congregation as well as text others members of the congregation, and I've kind of got a feel for who would be willing to come and who will not. And so we're going to go ahead and press on the 31st. I think we will have a much smaller crowd than we normally do, but that's okay. It's going to take a while for us to get used to the new reality and whether or not we feel comfortable coming back together. So for those of you who are willing, I want you to look forward to that next Sunday morning, May the 31st. And for those of you who do not quite feel comfortable yet, we will still be putting this online for you for the foreseeable future so that you can participate with us. Also, I want to let you know if you're watching this as a part of the worship playlist and not just the sermon by itself, at the very end of our playlist today, we are going to have a video from Natasha and Arkoshka in Russia, who are going to give an update on how they are dealing with things over there and also the work that they are doing in the midst of that. So I hope that you'll tune in for that as our very last video for the week, and I think you'll be blessed by what they have to say. Well, we are still in the midst here of this series of lessons on the journey back to the assembly. As we look at the Psalms of Ascent from Psalm 120 to Psalm 134, these psalms that were sung on the way to the great festivals that took place 3 times a year in Israel. We've seen a number of different themes in the psalms that we have looked at. Today, we are going to come back to a psalm that is a reflection upon the Lord's faithfulness to his people. The fact that the Lord is on our side. And even though we are surrounded by enemies in a number of different ways, which we're going to talk about today, the Lord is with us. The Lord is watching out for us. And the Lord ultimately is going to take care of us. That's what Psalm 124 is about. And so I invite you to join in and reading it with me, and then we'll spend some time reflecting on it here today. Psalm 124. If the Lord had not been on our side, let Israel say, if the Lord had not been on our side, when men attacked us, when their anger flared against us, they would have swallowed us alive. The flood would have engulfed us. The torrent would have swept over us. The raging waters would have swept us away. Praise be to the Lord, who has not let us be torn by their teeth. We have escaped like a bird from the fowler's snare. The snare has been broken, and we have escaped. Our help is in the name of the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. I don't think that I would be mistaken in saying that for most of us, we really long for the coming age. Now, admittedly, we don't know all that much about the age to come. We know in the letter of 1 John that the Apostle John tells us that we do not yet know what we will be, but we do know this, that we'll be like Christ. So we don't know a lot about our future. But in another great letter from John, this time the letter of Revelation, he tells us a lot more about the things that we might expect, that all of our tears will be wiped away, that there will be no more mourning or death or crying or pain, for the old order of things have passed away, and everything has been made new. Yes, it's true, we don't know everything about the future age to come, but we know enough to know that it is going to be wonderful. So we long for the age to come. And the reason that we long for it is because we have learned that as good as things can be here, and let's admit, sometimes they can be really quite good, we've also learned that bad is always lurking nearby. I don't know if you're like me or not, but whenever I have a long period of time when things are going good and things seem to be stable and really enjoyable, I begin to get a little bit paranoid because I wonder what's going to be around the next corner. What's the next bad thing that might happen? I remember after spending several years wrestling with depression and finally coming out on the other side of that, for a number of years, things have gone really well, and I always find myself going back to this thought, I wonder what might be next. I wonder what bad thing will be around the corner. It will be so wonderful to come to that point in time when we won't have to worry about the next bad thing. Because, as the great song says, scenes of bliss forever new will forever rise into our view. Right now, corporately, we are experiencing one of these difficult things together that we could not have expected, nor did we see it coming. The coronavirus has come upon not only our nation, but upon the whole world. And so it has cast all of us into a very difficult time. For some of us, it's more difficult than others because some have lost jobs, others are sick or know people who are sick, still others are isolated and don't have their normal means of support, and therefore it causes great mental distress in them. And we are all experiencing this difficulty that has been thrust upon us that we did not see coming. But even as that has happened to us in our corporate life together, I think we also recognize that it often happens in our individual lives. We never really know what is around the corner. We never really know what the next enemy is that we are going to have to face. And yet, here we still are. As difficult as some of those things are, we have survived them. And what we can learn from these situations, if we're willing to learn it, is that God is with us, that He never abandons His people. In this psalm that we are exploring here this week, Psalm number 124, we see the same kind of witness being put forth in this psalm. It is an expression of the people of God that says, here is our experience. The Lord has never abandoned us, and indeed, He will never abandon us. Now, just like in the psalm that we read last week, Psalm number 123, we don't know the specific context of this particular psalm. Last week, we talked about the psalmist as he looked up to his eyes to heaven to ask for help from the Lord to have mercy upon him. And we talked about three different scenarios that might have been the historical context for how this psalm came together. One was that it may have been written in the time when the king of Assyria came and laid siege to the city of Jerusalem, and the people were desperate, thinking they were going to die in the city. Another time could have been in Babylon when the people were taken into captivity and they were crying out to the Lord for mercy as they endured the contempt of the people there. And yet still another possibility may have been the time of Nehemiah when they were rebuilding the wall and the people and the nations around Israel were casting scorn upon them. Well, any one of these historical contexts, along with others that we may not have mentioned, could be the background here to Psalm number 124, this reflection on how the Lord is on our side against our enemies. But if you'll notice, if you have a little heading under Psalm 124, your heading may say something like this. This is at least what my Bible says. It is a song of ascent, that is one of the songs that we've been studying, and it is of David. Now, we talked about a few weeks ago that these later inscriptions that say some psalms were written by David, those are not part of the inspired text. It is just a historical, I guess I should just say it is a part of a historical tradition that David was the writer of these psalms. But in a lot of the psalms, when you read them, you think, yeah, that probably was written by David. And the same is true here. When you read this psalm and hear the experience that is reflected in the psalm, you think to yourself, yeah, that probably was written by David. if we are correct, and if tradition is correct that this was written by David, here's what scholars say is likely the historical context of this particular psalm. The background comes from 2 Samuel chapter 5. And while I'm not going to have you turn to that passage, I do want to tell you the story of what takes place there. In 2 Samuel chapter 5, David finally becomes the king of all of Israel. Not only Judah in the south, where he had been king in his younger days, but now he has united all the tribes together, and he is the one king of Israel. This has come after many years of struggle for King David. He battled against Saul as Saul tried to persecute him as the man who was going to be his replacement. Then, after the Saul fell, he still had the battle of putting all the tribes together because the tribes didn't get along with one another, and yet David was going to try to unite them all so that he could be king over one Israel. Well, finally, in 2 Samuel chapter 5, that is accomplished. David becomes king over all of Israel, and Israel is united together under their monarch. But no sooner does the king of all Israel come to his throne and reign there in Jerusalem than a new enemy arises. You probably know who this enemy is. It's the Philistines. Now, when we hear the Philistines today, we don't really think much about it. They're just a character in the Bible, and we don't really get a sense of how intimidating they were. But let me tell you, in David's day, as he had to lead Israel out in battle to face the Philistines were a very powerful people. They had a very powerful army. And so when the Philistines gathered together their troops to marshal against King David, this new monarch, in order to try to teach him a lesson about who the true sovereign people of the land were, this was a very intimidating circumstance. But by the time you come to the end of 2 Samuel chapter 5, the Lord has been with David. As a matter of fact, David went to the Lord and said, "Shall I go up and fight these people?" And the Lord said, "Yes, I will be with you." And he was with David, and he was with Israel. And they defeated the Philistines. It very well could be that this psalm is one that was written by David that is reflecting upon the experience of God standing with them against their enemies. If David did write this, then verse 1 begins with David making a proclamation. "If the Lord had not been on our side," David says. But then he doesn't stop there. He says, "Let Israel say." In other words, let Israel sing this song with me. And then supposedly all of Israel joins in. "If the Lord had not been on our side," they say with him, "when the men attacked us, when their anger flared against us, they would have swallowed us alive." In other words, if this is the historical situation of the psalm, the people of Israel are saying, if God had not been our side, when the Philistines rose up against us, we surely would have been defeated. They would have swallowed us alive. And the picture is of an ancient sea beast, sort of like the one, the Leviathan, that's talked about in the book of Job, who comes flying out of the water and snatches them in one bite with his jowls. That's what would have happened to the people of Israel if the Lord had not been on their side. But then I want you to notice the language that David uses as he reflects upon the danger that they were facing. Look at verse 4. He says, "The flood would have engulfed us. The torrent would have swept over us. The raging waters would have swept us away." He's using words here like a flood and a torrent and the raging waters. All these things that could have been and would have been destructive to the people of Israel if God had not been on their side. Well, as you hear that language, What does that draw your thoughts back to? I don't know about you, but the thought it evokes in my mind is when Israel was crossing through the Red Sea. Here were the waters that were piling up on both sides as the great enemy, the Egyptians, were coming on their backside. And Israel is crossing across the dry land there. And here are the raging waters who are being held in a wall. God is clearly doing this. And if for one moment God had turned his attention away, if he had not upheld those waters, the flood, the raging torrent, they would have come crashing down on the people and swallowed them whole. That's what David is saying here, along with all the people of Israel, as they reflect upon this Philistine threat. If God had not been on our side, just like he was with our forefathers, then the flood, the raging waters, the torrents of the sea would have overcame us, and we would have been washed away. But that's not what happened. God was faithful to them. And so they say in verse 6, "Praise be to the Lord, who has not let us be torn by their teeth. We have escaped like a bird from the fowler snare. A snare has been broken, and we have escaped. Our help is the name of the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth." In these final verses, the word picture changes. Instead of the roaring waters that could have come upon them and submerged them quickly, instead it's like a bird escaping from the jowls of a cat or some enemy that was ready to prey upon them. God plucked them out of there, and God saved his people. And so the people of Israel, along with David, are saying, if the Lord had not been on our side, none of this could have happened. But because he was on our side, we were saved. Perhaps you and I can feel the urgency of this psalm right now in a very special way, more so than we would in normal times. As I was saying a little bit earlier, this virus has come upon us, and while I'm not aware of any of our members of our congregation who have been sick with the virus, nonetheless, it has all affected our life, either from the fact that we can't go out and do what we want to do. Some people have lost jobs. Others are isolated in their homes, and they can't go visit people and see people. The struggles that we might have with all sorts of things are sort of magnified because of this. In many ways, it can look like the enemies are piling up against us. And many of us will have to admit we're a little bit intimidated because we don't know what's going to happen, what the future is going to hold, what's going to happen to the economy and to our lives, and are we going to get sick? Is something going to happen to us? The enemies are present. So a psalm like this speaks to us in this moment. But beyond our corporate struggle that we are all having, not only among our church and among the nation and the whole world that they're having with the coronavirus, but beyond those corporate struggles, there are the individual battles that we are fighting, the individual enemies that we are oppressed by. I'm aware this week of our members, some of our members who are wrestling with cancer and who have to go back and forth between good news and bad news and new treatments and wondering what's going to happen in the future. The enemies seem to be piling up, and how intimidating that must be. I'm thinking about others in our congregation who might normally struggle with mental illness. And this has only exacerbated that because we do not have our normal means of getting out and getting sunshine and doing some of the things that we would normally do and seeing people, and that's putting a lot of pressure on them. But there's still another level here that affects all of us. Even as Corona rages, and our individual battles are taking place, there is still the spiritual battle that is taking place with all of us. We have spiritual enemies. Those enemies are attempting to deceive us. They're attempting to lie to us. They are tempting us to greed, tempting us to fear. They are playing upon our lusts and our desires. That spiritual battle is still taking place in the midst of all this. And because many of the things that we normally depend upon for comfort have now been kind of removed for us, whether that be the security of your income or entertainments that you depend upon or any of those kinds of things. For some of us, I know it's true that spiritual battle is especially acute right now. The enemies of God's people are coming from every direction. But this psalm stands as a witness over time that God's people have said to one another, God will not abandon you in your circumstances. David knew that because when he went up to fight against the Philistines, he inquired of the Lord, and the Lord said, I will be with you. And when the whole experience was over, he could come back with the people of Israel and say, if the Lord had not been on our side, we would have been defeated. So that's how David knew. He had a direct word from the Lord. But how do we know? How can we be reassured that our enemies will not overtake us? That indeed we are secure in God's hands in an ultimate sense? Well, like David, we too have a word from the Lord. The word comes from the Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 8, and it's worth reminding you of here today. If God is for us, who can be against us? He who did not spare his own son, but gladly gave him up for us all, how will he not also, along with him, graciously give us all things? Who will bring any charge against whom God has chosen? In other words, what enemy could bring any charge? No one. It is God who justifies. And who is it that might condemn us? What enemy might condemn us? The great accuser, Satan? No. Christ Jesus, who died, and more than that, who was raised to life, is at the right hand of God and is interceding for us. Who will separate us from the love of Christ? Shall trouble or hardship or persecution or famine or nakedness or danger or sword, the coronavirus or cancer or mental illness or lust or greed or any of these other things? No, Paul says. In all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. You see, church, we have a word from the Lord just as David did. Can we go up against our enemies? Will we survive? The Lord says yes. For if I am for you, who can be against you? And so today, we can sing together with David, if it had not been the Lord who was on our side, the enemy would have defeated us. He would have swallowed us alive. But blessed be the Lord who would not give us up. God bless you and have a good week.